Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. Is the mic going? Is the mic working? I hope so. I have no way. Okay, there you go. I can see that it's working. Cool. I might need to check the gain on that. Anyway, here we are. Another day. And you can see God is my Baba. Anyway, today's reading was Genesis 12 to 15. So we're back into the sort of normal timeline, at least canonically. And I guess just some catch up. We've looked at their various genealogies up until Terah, who is Abraham's dad. In Genesis 11, let me get that up quickly. Um, yeah, so in Genesis 11, um, and we've seen that Abraham, Terah, Sarai, and Lot, they moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans, um, and they've gone down to Haran, and they've been living in Haran. But now God sort of reveals Himself directly to Abraham. So Genesis 12 verse 1, we get that first introduction to, not introduction, we get that first charge of God to Abraham to leave his country, his relatives, and his father's family and go to the land that He will show you. Now, the first thing that sort of showed, the first thing that came there is, I mean, most of us, everyone pretty much knows Abraham's story, right? Eventually going up until the point of, offering, being willing to, just about to kill his son Isaac after all that time. But this was sort of his first test, as it were. Leave to a place I will show you. Now, I think it can't be undersold how much faith is still required here. It's not here, go to place A, you know, it's leave and I'll show you where you're going. Whether or not that would be the best place, whether or not that's going to be an incredible place, whether or not your enemies are going to be there, whether or not it's going to be a long journey. None of these things are known to Abraham at the time. Abraham, not even Abraham, but he trusts and he goes. For the promise that is given to him is going to be, he's going to be he's going to be blessed to be a blessing, famous and a great nation. There's an incentive to leave, but it still takes some trust, some faith to go. And so, having displayed such faith, before we even hit chapter 13, there's already an issue. Um, he in Canaan, faces a famine and has to move down to Egypt. Now, this is the same guy who's had enough faith to just leave, going wherever God is going to show him. But then even though he's got that faith, he doesn't have enough faith for God to protect him. And then he's about to enter Egypt. He tells his wife, "Look, they're going to try to kill me for you. Say that you're my sister." So I find it interesting because Abraham is a person. He's a man, right? And he's had enough faith to do a certain thing that's quite significant, but not enough faith to go and face, go into a foreign land at risk of death. And so not that there's levels to it, but I think it grounds him. At least in my mind, I think it's easy to presume, knowing the full story, the culminating in the near sacrifice of Isaac. It's easy to hold him on a certain pedestal. He is one of the patriarchs of the faith, of course. Um, but he was still a human being, still very much fear of his death, of for his life, which is understandable. That was a time, and even now, fearing people can be evil, and can do evil things to other people. So there's an understanding there. I think that struck me on this reading. Despite having the faith to leave, he still, didn't have the faith to enter into this foreign land and ask his wife to lie. Um, what even strikes me even further, and again, we're in the Old Testament now, so this is supposed to be do good, get good, do bad, get got God. But when he leaves Egypt, after the whole debacle of Pharaoh taking in Sarah, um, and then God sending plagues on them, again, that actually suggests to me that Pharaoh must have had Sarah for at least a period of time, right? Because plagues, for it to be plagues, and for it to have taken long enough for them to determine what the cause of the plague was, suggests that it was more than just maybe a day or two, you know. And yet, when Abraham leaves Egypt, it isn't some big chastisement. It isn't some big, oh, trust me, don't lie. It's God reaffirms his covenant, you know. Um, I found that very, very interesting. But in chapter 13, Lot and Abraham separate. They go their separate ways. Um, and again, that's where God reaffirms His promise and says, "Look about you in every direction. I'm giving you this land and your descendants." Um, which I also imagine maybe was God also comforting him on his nephew, who he'd taken in as his son, leaving. Not only leaving, but he was leaving because their herdsmen were fighting amongst each other, and having been given opportunity to leave, Lot is taking the very fertile area. So I can imagine there's some. It's an amicable separation by all accounts, but I imagine it's hurting. And God just reaffirms the promise to Abraham, again, without sort of chastising him or bringing up his failure in Egypt, which I very much see it as a failure. You know, it resulted in God sending plagues. So I can say, yeah, probably is a failure. But anyway, it's interesting that God doesn't chastise him immediately or discipline him or discount him for his deception, but rather, the next interaction we see between God and Abraham is God reminding him, reaffirming his promise to him. I think that's interesting, and that should color the image that we have of God, especially in the Old Testament. And having finished the book of Job, the other thing I'm thinking on is what I'm wanting to ask the question: what is the Bible? What is it for? What's what is it trying to be? And thus far, it seems like it's trying to be a historical account, right? It's not trying to be a scientific manual that scientifically details the creation of the universe and man. There's an account for it, first 2-3 chapters, but I don't think it's given as a um I think it's almost is given as an account of history, not a scientific account. It's not, well, God combined these elements to create this, and the sun was burning in this fashion, and the earth is spinning, and gravity. Of course, it didn't have those words then, but it's not given as as a scientific document would seek to detail a process and allow for it to be repeatable. It's just given an account of things that happened with language of the people there, but then also I imagine with language that um, befits the manner in which the account was acquired, right? The story is told, and there's a greater light and a smaller light by people who, they didn't see it because they weren't there. Man was created on the sixth day, um, but however this was revealed to them, right? That language filters into the account, the history that's kept in the book, and it's kept an account of Adam, all the way down to Noah, all the way down to now Abraham, right? And it's recording events, historical events. Now, in as much as it's recording those events, we know later on that the Bible is useful for doctrine and correction, in Timothy 3:16. But it's clearly an account of history, and more importantly, an account of God's interaction with peoples during history. So we've had him with Adam all the way down to Noah. We've had God's interaction with Job, and now we're coming to God's interaction with Abraham. Right? That eventually becomes God's interaction with a people and nation, and then out of that nation, God's interaction as a man. Um, and then finally, God's interaction as a judge. But we'll get there by the end of the year. So, Abraham separated with Lot, and in chapter 14, Lot gets captured when we have this major war, 4 versus 5 kings in chapter 14. Abraham, I keep saying Abraham, forgive me. Abraham gets word of his nephew's capture. He, with 318, go liberate Lot, bring them back, and the king of Sodom comes out. Well, before that, weird dude, interesting dude, Melchizedek makes an appearance, right? And Melchizedek, when Abraham is bringing all the spoils of war, the captives of Sodom and Gomorrah. The king of Sodom comes out to meet him. Melchizedek brings Melchizedek, who is both a priest and a king of Salem, which is important. He is a king and a priest, a royal priesthood. Interesting. He brings Abraham some bread and wine. Melchizedek, a king and a priest, interesting in and of itself, but a king, a priest of the Most High. Another interesting thing is the priestly line hasn't been established yet. The priestly line is established with Aaron, Moses' brother, right? And the Levitical um, tribe of Israel. That is yet to come. This Melchizedek isn't of that line because they haven't been born, right? But he is a priest of God the Most High. And we know it's God the Most High because it's the same God. He blesses Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And Abraham swears by the same God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, when he replies to the king of Sodom in the second. So we know it is Jehovah, the same God. Um, but Melchizedek is this interesting being who is a king, a priest, before the Aaronic line of priests, the Levitical line of priests, and is a priest of the God, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, the one true God. And he brings Abraham bread and wine. Where else do we see bread and wine? Communion. So he brings Abraham a communion, and Abraham's response is to pay a tithe, a tenth of all the goods he had recovered to Melchizedek. I think it's interesting, and I highlight it because I think later on we see reference to it in the New Testament, and it's again colors what may have gone on here and who ultimately Christ is, who is also a king and a priest and makes us kings and priests. Anyway, so we have this interesting interaction between Abraham and Melchizedek, having having liberated the people of Sodom that were captured in that war. Sorry, yeah, clearly tired. Genesis 15. Um, Sometime later, God speaks to Abraham, and again reaffirms his promise. He says, "Do not be afraid, Abraham, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." That suggests to me Abraham may have been having some doubts. And that's then confirmed when Abraham's response to this dream or vision is, "What good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? You've given me no descendants to be my heir." So there were clearly doubts that God seemingly addressed even before Abraham had expressed them. You know, where else are we told that before we go in to pray, God knows what we need? Yeah, before we even ask for them. We see that here with his interactions with Abraham. And all of this, again, remember, for without the, at least without recording of the discipline for Abraham's lying about his wife in Egypt. Um, and also, despite having the faith to move, and great faith it was, he's now, he's doubting. He's doubting how these blessings will happen, because he doesn't have a son. How is he to become a mighty nation without even a single son? You know. But when the Lord says to him, "No, you will have a son," in verse 6 of chapter 15, it says, Abraham believed, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. And so again, I think the main thing I'm taking from here is, on the one hand, faith doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be that you believe full and perfectly, and then you're made righteous. No, there was faith and belief in God, and that was all that required. Even if that faith and belief was not enough for him to, go into Egypt and face Pharaoh, with full bravado, knowing God has got his back, there was still faith, and belief enough for him to be called righteous. We're told, how much faith do we need? As small as a mustard seed. You know, I didn't even mean to wrap there. All right, cool. Oh, this is. You may have heard that I got a call. Um, oh, Jay, cool. I'll call my brother back. Um, yeah, but yes, we've seen this. Now there's this interesting thing that I want to get to as well. Having had his righteousness be counted as faith, God tells him to go and bring a 3-year-old heifer, female goats, ram, turtle dove, and pigeon. And God presents these things. Abraham presents these things, and he cuts each in half. Um, now God causes Abraham to fall into a deep sleep, and terrifying darkness comes on him, and then God reconfirms this promise that he has descendants. Well, he will have his descendants, but God promises him effectively what becomes of Israel. You can be sure your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land and will be oppressed for 400 years, but I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and they will come away with great wealth. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. So Abraham was in a place where the Amorites were. So God sort of details this covenant, and Abraham sees a smoking firepot and flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. You know. Now I was reading, not even reading, I heard preached about this, that this was one way in which they would sort of sign contracts, as it were, go between the halves of the sacrifice. But God is doing this on his own. It's a fire pot, smoking fire pot, and a torch that's going through. Abraham didn't go through. And that suggests a one-sided covenant. It's God's the only signatory to this contract. Abraham didn't. And that means it's only based on God, not Abraham. You know, that's interesting because it's similar to what Jesus has done. Jesus signed a contract on the cross, right? We didn't, right? And that covenant is only between effectively him and God. And I've paid a price. These people are good. Eh, Obviously, we have to accept it. But then that payment has already been made on everyone's behalf, as far as I am concerned. And then also, there's clearly a not ulterior motive, but multiple objectives here. The descendants are supposed to come back there to the land, but only after the sins of the Amorites have reached a certain point where it warrants their destruction, because people coming there is going to result in their destruction, and God's almost giving them grace until such a time should occur. Anyway, that's chapter 15. Tomorrow is Genesis 16 to 18, and we'll learn a little bit more about Sarai, Abraham's wife, character called Hagar, and the birth of Ishmael, Abraham's first son, albeit not the son of promise. So, cool. I hope this has been helpful and has encouraged someone to pick up a Bible, spend some time with God. Thank you for watching. Whenever you do, I do hope that it blesses you as well. And yeah, have a good rest of the evening. I'm out.